Today, we are diving into a really powerful principle from theology. Its supporters say that if you follow its logic, it leads to one single, absolutely inevitable conclusion about, well, everything. And it all starts from a very simple idea about the nature of God.
But really, at the very heart of this whole thing is one question. If you could just imagine the absolute best, most perfect ending for the entire universe, what would that look like? Just keep that question in your back pocket, because your answer to it is the key to understanding this entire principle.
You know, the wild thing is, this whole line of reasoning kicks off from a place that almost all of classical theology, across a ton of different traditions, completely agrees on. It's a common ground, a shared foundation.
And that foundation is this idea of maximal greatness. Now, it sounds a little academic, but all it really means is what most people would just call God, a being who isn't just great, or even really, really great. No, we're talking about the greatest conceivable being, someone who has every positive quality turned up to the absolute max. So, what are these great-making properties? Well, you've got the classics: all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, and so on. But here's the really crucial part. These attributes aren't in some kind of competition with each other. In a maximally great being, they all work together in perfect, seamless harmony.
Okay, so if you accept that starting point, this idea of a maximally great being, then that leads us to the central claim of the whole principle. According to the source, a very specific consequence just has to follow. The nature of the creator, you see, dictates the nature of the outcome.
And here it is, the linchpin of the whole argument. A maximally great God must, not should, not might, must produce a maximally great outcome. Why? Well, think about it. If there was a better possible ending, but it didn't happen, what would that imply? It would mean God was lacking in either the power to do it, the goodness to want it, or the wisdom to figure it out. And any one of those would break our starting premise of maximal greatness.
So this brings us to a head-to-head comparison. The source material takes two of the main scenarios for the end of everything and puts them side by side to see which one really holds up as a maximally great outcome.
So on one side, we have the view of eternal conscious torment, let's call it ECT, where some people are saved but a lot of people aren't. And on the other side, we have universal reconciliation, or UR, where everyone eventually is saved. And the source paints a really stark contrast here. Are we talking about God having undefeated enemies forever, or are those enemies transformed into his children? Is God's will only partly done, or is it fully and completely accomplished? All right, let's run these two scenarios through the filter of those great-making properties. Let's start with power. The argument here is pretty simple. Which outcome shows off more power? A God who manages to save some of his enemies, or a God who successfully reconciles all of them? The source concludes that universal reconciliation is the only vision that shows maximal, unstoppable power.
Okay, next up, wisdom. What's the wiser plan? To create beings, knowing that many of them are destined for what the source calls a cosmic tragedy? Or to create beings, knowing that whatever it takes, all of them will eventually be brought home in a cosmic victory? The principle argues that the latter is the only outcome that makes sense for a maximally wise being. Now let's talk about love. Is a maximal, perfect love something that's limited to a select few? Is it conditional? Does it just give up on someone once they die? Or is it a love that's universal, that's relentless, and, as the source puts it, a love that never fails? And finally, justice. The source makes a really sharp distinction between two kinds of justice. First, there's retributive justice. It's about payback. And in the ECT model, it means infinite punishment for a finite lifetime of sins. But then there's restorative justice, which is about correcting, healing, and making things right. The argument is that a justice that actually fixes and restores things is a far greater, far more perfect form of justice. Of course, I know what you're probably thinking. This line of reasoning has to have some big holes in it, right? There are some major common objections, and the source material tackles them head-on. So let's walk through the big ones and see what the responses are. The first one, and maybe the biggest one you hear all the time, is about free will. The argument goes that God can't save everyone because, well, that would violate their freedom to choose to reject him forever. So the response from the maximal greatness principle kind of flips this whole objection on its head. It says that this argument actually puts a limit on God. It claims a maximally wise and powerful God is absolutely capable of persuading every single heart without ever forcing them.
It reframes the whole question. Can a finite human will permanently defeat the infinite redemptive plan of God? This principle says, no way.
All right, objection number 2 zeroes in on justice. You'll hear this idea that a sin against an infinite God logically demands an infinite punishment to be truly just.
The response here all comes down to the kind of justice a maximally great being would actually use. The source argues that perfect justice isn't about endless payback, it's fundamentally about restoring and healing. It sees scriptural things like the lake of fire not as an eternal barbecue, but more like a refiner's fire. A painful, for sure, but ultimately purifying and corrective process.
And the third major objection, of course, is the Bible itself. I mean, there are a lot of passages that people have traditionally read to mean there's an eternal hell, and once you're there, that's it. No escape.
The source's response here really dives into the original language. It argues that the Greek word we often translate as eternal, aionios, doesn't necessarily mean endless. It can also mean for an age or for a specific, long period of time. The idea is that passages about judgment are describing a temporary, corrective phase, while the passages about universal restoration are describing the ultimate, final goal of God's entire plan.
So after laying out that core idea, comparing the two big outcomes, and then tackling the main objections, the source material brings its whole case to what it calls an inevitable, purely logical conclusion.
The whole thing can be boiled down into this really simple 4-step piece of logic. If you accept premise 1 and premise 2, and you buy the case made for premise 3, then, logically, the conclusion just sort of becomes unavoidable.
And this leads to the final challenge that's posed to the audience. If you want to reject the conclusion, you have to reject one of the premises that got us here. But which one do you throw out? If you deny premise 1, you're pretty much abandoning classical theism. Denying premise 2 seems illogical. So the argument goes, you're left with having to deny premise 3, which means you have to argue that eternal torment is somehow a greater, more perfect outcome than everyone being saved.
And the source material ends on this incredibly powerful verse, putting all the emphasis on one word, all. Not some things, not most things, but the claim that all things come from, go through, and return to this maximally great being. It leaves us with a really provocative question. Is this the only conclusion that truly takes the idea of God's greatness all the way to its logical end?